for quite a while. So basically, we're going to look at a PowerPoint that is not based on your text's discussion of Plato's view of the forms, but is a very good one, and you know, we'll talk a little bit about your textbook next time. But I want to go through most or all of this. I didn't get through it all in the previous class, but I wanted to kind of orient you a little bit as to what we're doing here. Because you might have thought, well, I thought we're still kind of looking at what philosophy is, and we are. Go back to the myth or the allegory of the cave, right? What you get in that story is a story that can be looked at several different levels with several different meanings. We saw that one way we can make that story relevant to today is to think of the prisoners as being like us in that they're immersed in a particular culture represented by the cave down there, that they have a whole bunch of beliefs that they've acquired from childbirth by osmosis, by being immersed in their particular culture of the cave, and that their beliefs are essentially about what they immediately experience, which for them, since their head and necks are chained, are the shadows on the back of the wall. And we talked about the fact that the story can be looked at as getting us to confront the beliefs we've grown up with and we're comfortable with, much as Socrates did, being a gadfly, with the people that he came into contact with in Athens, you know, who thought they knew perfectly well, you know, had knowledge that was good about the things Socrates was talking about, and Socrates, when he questioned them, found they many times had beliefs that were wrong in a number of ways. They may have led to contradictions, like Thrasymachus' view of justice, or in other ways. So we can look at Plato's allegory of the cave, or parable or myth of the cave, as a story about what philosophy tries to do in getting us to examine the beliefs that we've grown up with, that we've been enculturated to have, and looking at the basis and the foundation for those beliefs. But Plato also means it to have a more technical meaning. He means it to be a story about his views of the nature of reality. Now, somebody may recall what I said about Socrates defending himself at his trial, trying to draw some distance between himself and the nature philosophers. Remember, Aristophanes was trying to paint Socrates as a nature philosopher, right? Explaining what makes it rain and cutting the gods out of the picture. Socrates was more concerned about how should we live. Socrates says, you want to know what I really taught the youth of Athens? It wasn't to be atheists. It wasn't to reject the city's gods. Socrates says, how could I have been doing that when I thought I had some of the direction for my life given to me by my friend Chaerephon's experience with asking the oracle at Delphi, who's the wisest man. And when the oracle said I set off on a quest trying to test that utterance. But how could I have taken that seriously without also believing that the oracle was genuinely speaking for Apollo? And how could I believe the oracle was genuinely channeling Apollo if Apollo wasn't there? So I'm not a total atheist, Socrates says. But he's saying, what I really taught the youth of Athens is not to care so much for the accumulation of wealth or power or a great job and position in Athenian society as much as they care for the state of their souls. He says, being wealthy doesn't necessarily make you a good person. But if you care first, Socrates wasn't against wealth, but he says if you care first about being a good person in the state of your soul, then things like wealth can come, but you'll have things put in perspective. You'll have a more rounded life. So Socrates says, get your priorities straight. But you can say, well, if Socrates was less concerned about theories of reality like the pre-Socratics, and more concerned with the aspects of philosophy that surrounded ethics and political philosophy and the philosophy of life, how is it then that in Plato's book, The Republic, we have Socrates coming out with an elaborate theory about the nature of reality, just the sort of thing the pre-Socratics were doing? Well, this raises the question, how much of the historical Socrates is there in Plato's dialogues? Because we already saw Socrates thought that Aristophanes' portrait of him was very far from reality. Experts in ancient philosophy differ on this, but the view on this that seems most plausible to me is that in the first dialogues Plato wrote, things like the Meno, and we saw a selection from that, the Apology, where Socrates defends himself at his trial, the Phaedo, where Socrates in prison tries to discuss the arguments for and against the soul going to an afterlife after it dies. Those early dialogues, this view says, probably give us a pretty good, accurate picture of the real Socrates that walked around Athens. But as you get into Plato's later works, you get a less accurate picture of Socrates, and you also get Socrates as a character voicing more developed views, things that Socrates would not necessarily have disagreed with, but things that Socrates didn't develop to the extent that Plato did. So you have Plato putting in the mouth of Socrates in the Republic, in the story of the allegory of the cave, a more developed theory of reality than maybe Socrates had during his own lifetime, but that he said a lot of things that indicated this view of reality. For Plato, what the prisoners were acquainted with is the lowest level of reality. Images of things. They can only see the shadow. But whether you're talking about, okay, folks, I appreciate that all of you are here, and I appreciate that you two are here. But I'd remind you again, look, you're not going to disturb me if you walk in late. You know, I used to play a little baseball. If you've got a pitcher with 50,000 people in the stands, a major league pitcher, the only thing he's focused on is that target the catcher is presenting for him, and the batter standing up there and getting that pitch where it needs to be. And all those 50,000 people fade into the background. When you're up here trying to deliver a lecture, the only thing you're thinking about is what you're going to develop next. What am I going to present next? I hate it when it does this. Let's see if it'll... I might have to restart it. Yeah. Okay, don't save it. But you will disturb your fellow classmates if you walk in late. Is the point that I'm trying to make, you know. So don't think so much about me, you know. I barely notice it when somebody walks in late if I'm up here trying to focus on a PowerPoint, but your classmates do. So, you know. Okay. Well, the point is, for Plato, what's going on that wall of the cave is the most unreal level of reality. Yeah, the shadows are real, but they're copies, and very imperfect copies, of the things that the guys are carrying in front of the fire in back of the prisoners, right? And so images of things are removed from reality, right? They're imperfect copies of the real things, whether they be shadows or the reflection of something in a mirror or a picture an artist draws, say, of a vase or a statue of something, a representation. Representations of things in this world are the farthest removed from reality. But that's what the prisoners think is the most real. And that's why they really need to revise their views of things. In Plato's story, the way it relates to his theory of reality is the world inside the cave is the world you and I are growing up in, the material world. Like Madonna, you know, we are material boys and girls here, right? You know, and the point is, you know, the reflection on the cave represent images of things in this world. The stuff the guys are carrying represents what we think are the most real things, right? The material objects, like the desks you all are sitting in. And the fire in Plato's story, because inside the cave represents this world, the fire represents the sun in this world, which illuminates things, right? But what Plato is going to try to convince us of is that to get real knowledge, and the purpose of what philosophy really tries to do, is to go one beyond this world. This is a world we grew up in, like Madonna. This is what we think is the most real. Plato's trying to get us to see that these are like shadows compared to the things outside the cave. And the things outside the cave are what the theory of the forms is all about. Plato is trying to convince us that there are eternal blueprints for what makes a triangle, what makes a chair or a desk a chair, for abstract concepts like justice, like moral goodness, like holiness. That there are eternal standards for these things. And they don't exist in this world, but they exist in the world of the forms where Meno's slave boy was at one time. And so part of what philosophy tries to do is to get us to recover what Socrates argues, knowledge that we had. That we once had knowledge of things in this realm, but Socrates' argument is that it's so shocking for a soul to become reincarnated in a physical body that this knowledge is knocked into a kind of latent state. And part of philosophy's task is to try to bring it to the surface. Now, of course, not everybody believes that we have some knowledge at birth, and certainly not everybody believes in reincarnation like Socrates and Plato did. And I'm not even asking you to accept their view, but I'm asking you to try to understand it. And you say, well, come on, Murawski. You know, everybody knows that things like standards for moral goodness, mathematical objects are just created objects. You know, standards are just culturally relative. You know, he's talking about eternal truths, things that hold across time and across cultures. Isn't that an old, outmoded view? Isn't the trendy view to be relativistic about these things? Well, you know, it might surprise you to find that there were relativists around in Plato's day, too. That the same kinds of relativistic views that we think are so in and so trendy now were around 2,500 years ago in their essentials when Plato and Socrates were walking around Athens, you know. And to a certain extent, Plato's trying to react against this. The people who held these views were itinerant teachers called sophists who went from city to city, culture to culture, and they were skeptical about our ever acquiring anything and any knowledge that really deserved the word, you know, about the human ability to gain real knowledge. And they were also very relativistic in their beliefs. You know, for them, a lot of things are just either relative to culture or relative to one's status in life and whatever. And that the best we can have is maybe some true opinions, but certainly not knowledge of what is lasting and eternal and infinite. This was their belief. So one person's opinion is as good as another's. You know, many of them were what we call subjectivists. That is, they view things like moral principles, principles of justice, as just being relative to what a given person thinks they are. So every person's opinion is as good as another. That view is also trendy today. But Plato and Socrates are trying to react against this. They're trying to argue that we can have some real knowledge and that there are some eternal truths. In other words, that it's eternally true what a triangle is, what a circle is, that an equilateral triangle has 360-degree angles and perfectly equal sides is something that for Plato is eternally true. And likewise, they argue that there are non-relative eternal standards for things like justice, and what makes a state just and a law just. So Plato is going to try to convince us that knowledge differs from mere true opinion. The true opinion can be about things in this world, but that real knowledge has to be about things in the realm of what he calls the forms, this eternal world. And so for knowledge to be stable and unchanging, it has to be about truths and about objects that are stable and eternal and unchanging. And this is what Parmenides thought of reality. So one argument that Plato's ideal standards, the forms, exist, is that if we're ever to have real knowledge, they have to be about these sorts of objects. They are what real knowledge is knowledge of, the forms. Now, there's an age-old view of knowledge dating back to Plato's time that knowledge is true justified belief. That not every belief that we have constitutes knowledge, and even true beliefs are not knowledge, but that we need also some justification, some support for the beliefs that we hold. And we saw that in writing philosophy and reading philosophy, we look for the arguments, for the reasons philosophers give for the views that they hold. So knowledge, and we're not going to beat this drum very hard, but one view, and the view that Plato and Socrates are here working with, is that knowledge has to be what's true. I mean, it would seem very odd that that we would claim to know what is false. If I said, hey, I know the Ravens are world champions this year because they won the Super Bowl, you'd say, come on, the Ravens weren't even in the Super Bowl this year. How can you claim to know that when it's not even true? You know, I mean, to claim to know something, it has to be true, but it also is something if we have knowledge, it has to be not only what's true, but of something that we personally believe to be true. It would be odd to claim that we know something that we don't also believe. So belief is necessary for real knowledge, but it's not sufficient by itself. Philosophers claim that to have real knowledge, we ought to have some reasons justifying our beliefs. The slave boy might have had some true opinions, but when Socrates shows him how to go through that geometric proof, then he's got some reasons to back up his true belief that if you want to make a square twice as big as the original, you build it on the diagonal, right? So for Plato, opinion is changeable. Again, these pages are to this other text. Changeable, can be true or false, not necessarily grounded in reasons, can be acquired just by persuasion, whereas knowledge is of what is enduring, it's always true. In other words, always true that an equilateral triangle has 3 angles that are 60 degrees. And it's grounded in some reasons, like the reasons the Meno's slave boy comes to have when he and acquired by instruction, and we give the example of that. So the idea is that what Meno's slave boy has knowledge of, when Socrates goes through this exercise with him of asking questions and supposedly drawing out knowledge his soul learned before it became incarnate. See, Plato's argument is not only that this unseen realm exists, but that our souls were once there, but we lost some of this knowledge. It's in a latent state. We can't know these eternal things, like perfect triangles, by our senses. Our senses only put us in touch with things in this world. But Plato's argument is that it's the slave boy's reasoning abilities. It's our rational abilities that are, the means by which we gain true knowledge. And this is one picture of what philosophy needs to be doing. It raises the question, are there things that our reason can put us in touch with that constitute better knowledge than the knowledge we gain even by our senses? And philosophers have disagreed with this over the years, over this. But the slave boy supposedly has this latent knowledge, but Socrates' questioning enables him to see the reasons that support his opinions, that building a square on the diagonal gives you one twice as big, enables him to rise above mere true beliefs to actual knowledge, because he's got supporting reasons behind him. In other words, he has not only true belief, but now true justified belief. These reasons justify his claim to know that to make a square twice as big as the original, you build it on the diagonal. Incidentally, we're going to have you all, duplicate that proof. We'll give you a little... No, not really. Only kidding. Only kidding. Duplicate Socrates' proof. So I thought I got away with from geometry. Hey, you may, if you want to go to graduate school, you'll have a geometry component on the GRE, the graduate record exam. So something to think about. At any rate, so supposedly the boy, for Socrates, all knowledge is a recollection of these eternal truths that our souls knew. And for him, the soul is most like things in this unseen realm, which is represented by the realm outside the cave. Right? The soul is unseen. It's invisible, just like the things in there. For Socrates and Plato, the soul is eternal and unchanging, etc. The soul wants to be with the forms again. Part of philosophy is to get us into that realm. Okay. So then the slave boy's knowledge is not about the imperfect, scratchings in the sand in Socrates' drawings. For Plato, genuine knowledge can't be about such fleeting and changing things. In other words, things in this world, even tables and chairs, these things, there was once a time when they didn't exist. They were built, but there's going to be a time when they're relegated to the trash heap and they go out of existence. Right? I can draw a triangle, but they can come into existence and they can go out of existence. But for Plato, genuine knowledge isn't about these things. It's about the eternal standards in the realm of the form for what makes triangles triangles. Genuine knowledge, then, is not acquired through our senses, but acquired by reason, and it's about what's eternal and enduring for Plato. So this is an example of what is called rationalism, and Parmenides thought that real reality had to be perfect and eternal and unchanging. So Plato has in his realm of the form objects that are perfect and eternal and unchanging. And a way to kind of get a grasp on this is to ask yourself things like this. What it is to be a triangle. Did that just come into existence when the first human being thought up a triangle? Or did what it is to be a triangle somehow exist even before the first human being discovered what a triangle is? You know, is it somehow true eternally what makes a triangle and a square? You know, well, for Plato, that's the case. You know, no instruments could construct such a perfect object in this world. They exist in the world beyond the senses. They're about things that Plato calls forms. One way of thinking about them is perfect blueprints for what things are in this world. So for Plato, the things we think are so real in this world are really imperfect copies of the perfect standard for a desk in the realm of the form, the perfect standard for a triangle. You know, so the true object of the slave boy's knowledge then is not any particular square, but squareness itself, or the square. You know, the absolute standard for what makes a square in the realm of the form. And it's a property shared by all squares. Plato calls this participation. They participate in this property of squareness. All individual desks participate in deskness, so to speak. So the eternal truths of geometry then are not about things like drawings on a whiteboard or scratchings in the sand, but they're about these eternal forms. And this knowledge is accessible to anyone, but it's acquired through reason, not through the senses. The senses don't put us in touch with perfect triangles, but it's our reasoning ability that does. This is what Plato and Socrates argue. And I'm not going to stay on this, but he also thinks there are perfect standards for moral qualities like holiness or piety, like moral goodness, justice. Plato argues that there are perfect non-relative standards for things like this, that there are forms for abstract concepts as well as for concrete things like triangles and desks and chairs. So knowledge, he agrees with Parmenides, can only be of what is eternal. They have to be of those kinds of objects. Heraclitus thought that everything is constantly changing. We can't step in the same river twice. Fleeting things in this world come into existence. They're ever changing. They go out of existence. They're not the objects of true knowledge, but things like the square itself, the equal itself. Look at the two lines on the blackboard. I can say, well, these are two lines equal in length. Or if I don't have chalk with me because I knew I have a whiteboard in here, not a blackboard. But if you took two pieces of chalk out of that are brand new out of a box of chalk, and they're unbroken, and you held them up, you'd say, well, here are two pieces of new chalk, they're equal in length. But you and I know, if we had a sensitive enough measuring instrument, maybe one based on laser technology, and measured them, we'd find they weren't perfectly equal in length, that one would be just a little longer than the other. If we tried to draw two equal lines, even if instead of doing them freehand we used a ruler, we could still say the lines are equal in length but not perfectly equal in length. But Socrates argues in Plato's Dialogue the Phaedo How can you make a judgment like that unless you already know what perfect equality is? How can you judge that two lines are equal but not perfectly equal unless you know what perfect equality is, but no two lines are perfectly equal in this world? Perfect equality is a form. So Socrates argues, in order to even make a common sense everyday judgment like these two lines are equal but not perfectly equal, that shows that we know an eternal object, perfect equality, a form, in order to make a judgment like that. Now, there are other ways of accounting for how that's possible that don't presuppose the existence of an eternal object like the form of perfect equality. But I'm trying to make Socrates and Plato's case here, right? You'll find that's what I will be doing throughout the semester, even if I discuss views that I personally disagree with. And you will find views you disagree with, and hopefully you'll find some you agree with. But I try to give people their day in court, so to speak. I try to relate people's views and the reasons they give for them in a way that makes their case believable in the way that they would make them themselves if they were in front of you trying to convince you of them. Well, the argument we just gave is what some experts call the epistemological argument for the forms. You say, what? I haven't gone over the branches of philosophy. I'll do that maybe next time. I forgot to do that. Episteme is a Greek word for knowledge. Epistemology is the area of philosophy that deals with the questions about knowledge. Can we know anything for certain? Do we have any, and how do we come to know things? What is knowledge? Questions about the scope and limits of knowledge are epistemological. This is an argument for the forms that is called the epistemological argument for the forms because it says, look, the forms have to be there in order for us to have true knowledge, knowledge of the eternal. True knowledge has to be knowledge of the forms. So the previous argument then justifies the existence of the forms by claiming that they're needed as the objects of genuine knowledge. If the slave boy has genuine knowledge about geometry, it has to be of the perfect forms of triangles that are eternal. So these have to exist if true knowledge is possible. There's another argument that goes from the nature of what is real, called the metaphysical argument for the forms. One question it considers is whether there's anything that exists that's universal in nature, or is what exists only particular. The forms are universal entities. The form of a triangle is a universal object that is true of every triangle. So this metaphysical argument says that if two things share a common characteristic, then the characteristic that they share exists as a real thing. In other words, if two chairs share the common characteristic of chairness, then chairness really exists as the characteristic that they both share, or the way I presented in this slide is if you have two squares and they share the common characteristic of squareness, then that form, that characteristic, has to actually exist. Now, some of you are wiggling around in your seats saying, I don't know if I buy this. This is what the 20th century philosopher Willard Van Orman Quine called the reification of universals. In other words, an argument that makes these universal entities true. It says, again, that if two things share a common characteristic, then there is something, there really exists something which they share and have in common. So if two squares share squareness, then there really is an eternal property of squareness that exists in Plato's eternal realm. And there's a view called mathematical Platonism that some mathematicians espouse even today that holds that objects like squares, that the things that the theorems of geometry are true about are eternally existing objects. Now, my teachers at Poly, when they talked about a perfect triangle, they knew you didn't have one in this world as well as Plato did. But they called it an imaginary triangle. Consider a perfect equilateral triangle, an imaginary triangle that has three perfectly equal sides and three angles of 60 degrees each. It's a figment of our imagination in their belief. It's a constructed, artificially constructed object that has no more reality than the tooth fairy does or a unicorn for mathematicians that are called constructivists. But for Plato, it's just the opposite. Plato's trying to stand on its head your version, your beliefs about what's real. For Plato, not only are these perfect triangles real, they are more real than any fleeting material triangle I could draw that can come into and go out of existence. The perfect standard for a triangle exists eternally. So for Plato, the things outside the cave are even more real. And a particular chair or a particular square is an imperfect copy in matter of the perfect blueprint for a square in the realm of the forms. So this is Plato's theory about reality. I just make this point again with largeness. He says if two things share the property of largeness, then there is a form of largeness that they share in common. You know, that just makes the same point. Well, this is kind of where I left off. There's another argument for the existence of forms that trades on language. Semantics has to do with the meaning of words. The semantic argument for the forms says we all have proper names, right? I would call out your proper name when I call the roll, and hopefully just one person answers, right? I'm the only person in here with a proper name of Victor Morawski, right? But this argument says that just as the name Victor Morawski singles out only one particular man, at least in this room, so a general term like human being or man a general word like that is the proper name for the form human being or the form manness. In other words, if we're not going to give a desk a name, but suppose we called this desk Charlie and we said that no other desk in this room is going to be named Charlie. The name Charlie singles out this desk and this desk only, but deskness is the proper name for the form of deskness that all these desks have in common. So Gertrude singles out a particular elephant, but the general word elephant that all elephants share in common is the proper name of the form of elephant or elephantness that all elephants share in common. That's the semantic argument for the existence of the forms. So for Plato, there are literally two worlds. The world inside the cave that our senses put us in touch with, and the eternal world outside the cave, the realm of the form. So Plato would rid us of our bias toward the senses. Real knowledge, he says, goes beyond the senses. We see that things like perfect beauty, perfect equality, or squareness, these forms aren't just imaginary entities, but they're more real than the things in this world, and they're things our reason puts us in touch with. So one view of philosophy is that our reasoning abilities can give us an in to the nature of reality that goes beyond anything that our senses can do. Now, not surprisingly, that has been a controversial view to hold since the time of Plato. But there are philosophers today who hold that that's what philosophy ought to be about. That there are some non-relative eternal truths to know. Okay. Well, we'll talk about this next time. But basically, Valentine's Day's coming up. Many of you women will get roses. If you looked at a rose closely enough, you'd find it has imperfections. For Plato, every particular rose is less than perfect and less than perfectly beautiful, but beauty itself is perfectly beautiful. We'll look at that next time. Okay, go on in the syllabus past this. I forget what we have. We may look at some of the things in your textbook. I see the roll there. If somebody could bring up the roll, if anyone missed it as it was going around make sure that you're recorded on it. And let me shut this.